2 Italian immigrants have been accused of robbery and murder, but there's no evidence proving that they're guilty. However, they're anarchists, and it's 1920. And for these 2 immigrants, this case isn't going to end well. Let's talk about the case of Sacco and Vanzetti. Okay, let's do a bit of backtracking here first. It's 1918 and Russia has officially become the Soviet Union, which means it's now a communist nation. Since the Soviet Union is now communist, it has caused a major panic here in the United States. The new fear of communism has swept over the United States, and anybody that wasn't quote-unquote American was accused of either being a communist, a socialist, or even an anarchist. By the 1920s, here in the United States, if you were an immigrant, unfortunately, most of the time, you were accused of either being a communist, a socialist, or an anarchist. A great example of how immigrants were treated here in the United States in the 1920s is the Palmer raids, where the US government issued raids and mass deportations of immigrants, accusing them of either being communist, socialist, or anarchists. This is noted as the Red Scare in the 1920s. This is going to lead us into 2 very important key characters in this case, Nicola Sacco and Bartholomew Vanzetti. In 1908, Sacco and Vanzetti arrived here in the United States separately, but both arriving in Massachusetts. Sacco came here to the United States, got married, had a child, and became a shoe worker. Vanzetti, on the other hand, became a fish peddler. The 2 men then fell into circles of anarchists, which was within the Italian-American community here in the United States. When World War I broke out in 1917 for the United States, both men fled to Mexico to avoid the draft. So here is where the case begins. It's April 15th, 1920. There are 2 gentlemen, a payroll clerk named Frederick Parmenter, and a security guard named Alessandro Bardinelli. I hope I said those 2 names correctly. These 2 men were trying to make a deposit for their company, and unfortunately their lives were taken and they were shot to death, and they were robbed of all the money that they were going to deposit. Keep in mind it's 1920, so if you want to deposit any sort of money, you have to do it by hand, and all that money is physical. So they lost over $15,000 in cash. There were eyewitnesses of this case. The eyewitnesses say they saw 2 men rob and murder these 2 gentlemen, and then got into another car where there was 3 other people from our understanding, and then took off. The eyewitnesses also made a factor of thinking that these men looked somewhat Italian. So when the police got a hold of this, they only really targeted Italian Americans here in the United States for this case. This leads us to Sacco and Vanzetti being arrested on a trolley car. Both men were armed, and Sacco actually had a flyer in his pocket saying that Vanzetti was going to speak at an anarchist meeting that they had upcoming. Both men were arrested. However, there were no other arrests that were made during this case, and they never even found the stolen money to link to Sacco and Vanzetti, proving that they did in fact rob these 2 men and murdered them. It's also important to note here that Vanzetti has already been in some hot water with the law of being accused of a different crime. So you can also argue the fact that they were trying to look for somebody to target that they had already arrested, and that kind of fit the mold of being an Italian American, and also didn't help the fact that these 2 men did identify as anarchists, or at least were a part of the anarchist community here in the United States. The trial began the following May, and Sacco and Vanzetti were up for robbery and murder, and possibly even facing the death penalty. Judge Webster Thayer was given this case. However, he was notorious for having a strong bias against immigrants and also any anarchists, communists, or socialists. He was really feeding into the Red Scare in the 1920s here. Judge Thayer was granted and given the case, and he was actually the judge in Vanzetti's prior arrest. This would be the second time that the judge and Vanzetti would be in a courtroom together. Sacco and Vanzetti had a very famous labor lawyer on their side, Fred Moore, And Fred Moore will push to the very end to prove that these two men are innocent. Moore will repeatedly antagonize Judge Thayer throughout this entire case and remove every businessman from the jury pool. It's also important to note that there were no Italian Americans on the jury for Sacco and Vanzetti's case. As the trial began, eyewitnesses did take the stand. There was one eyewitness that noted that the shooter actually spoke good English, which contradicts Sacco's very heavy Italian accent. I'm not sure if Vanzetti also had a heavy accent, but if him and Sacco arrived at the same time here in the United States, I'm going to safely assume that he probably did also have a pretty thick accent. Prosecutors are going to argue that one of the 4 bullets that were brought into evidence actually matched Sacco's gun. The other bullets are believed to be shot by the second gunman. However, nobody really testified if they saw a second shooter or the second man shooting. There was no confirmation. When District Attorney Frederick Kotzman got to interrogate or even question Sacco and Vanzetti on the stand, he was relentless. When Sacco and Vanzetti took the stand and Kotzman was questioning them, he mostly focused on the men's political beliefs rather than the case at large. It seems like the district attorney was more trying to prove to the jury that these men were in fact anarchists, which was a proven fact. However, he wasn't really focusing on the fact that these two men did in fact commit the crimes, which is still questionable. Sacco and Vanzetti's defense attorney will consistently object to the questioning that Sacco and Vanzetti were enduring. However, Judge Thayer would overrule every single one of them. After the case was officially over, the jury went in to deliberate for about 5 hours, which actually isn't that long of a time if you think about when it comes to the extreme lengths of this case and also the lack of evidence in this case. After 5 hours of deliberation, both men were found guilty. Overall, this court case wasn't very long and the lack of evidence was outstanding in this case. I don't know what really anybody was really working with here, but the fact that these two men were found guilty with little to no evidence is outrageous. Most of the world kind of had this same point of view, and when the verdict was released about Sacco and Vanzetti being found guilty, the entire world basically lost it. These reactions worldwide got very violent. There were multiple protests, specifically in Europe, that really felt like Sacco and Vanzetti had an unfair trial. American embassies in Europe were being flooded with letters trying to prove or like essentially get Sacco and Vanzetti a retrial. Judge Webster Thayer actually had to put his house under protection with the amount of threats and violence that he was enduring during this time period. There were worldwide protests that were happening for Sacco and Vanzetti. For example, France had a protest, Spain, Belgium, Scandinavia, and so many more. Albert Einstein voiced his opinion, declaring that the men were given an unfair trial and also declared that they were innocent. Even the Pope got involved. There were plenty of supporters of Sacco and Vanzetti protesting of their verdict and their trial. As time passed on, Sacco and Vanzetti's attorney will declare a retrial or repeal their case. There was also a extreme flaw in the district attorney's case, where it actually came forward that the gun expert that was examining Sacco's gun actually framed Sacco in the fact that that bullet did not in fact come from Sacco's gun, and that they essentially makeshifted it to fit with the district attorney's case against Sacco and Vanzetti. Judge Thayer's bias really came to light when he actually denied the retrial for Sacco and Vanzetti's case in October of 1924. In the years follow, he'll actually deny 5 other motions. In late of 1925, new evidence actually resurfaced, which really shocked everybody. Sacco and Vanzetti apparently, or he was either both Sacco and Vanzetti or just Sacco, came across a man that actually confessed to the crime that they were being accused of. However, Judge Thayer yet again denies for a retrial. He basically said that you can't prove that that man has any sort of liability. By 1926, Massachusetts highest court actually came in and examined Judge Webster Thayer's decisions when it came to this entire case and the whole situation that has with Sacco and Vanzetti, and basically said that he wasn't really doing anything wrong. There were no errors or any biases that were affecting his decision. The International Labor Defense Party, which was actually also set up by the Communist Party, raised so much money in legal fees to help out Sacco and Vanzetti's case. Even a future Supreme Court judge will actually speak out against the verdict of Sacco and Vanzetti's case, basically also saying that it was an unfair trial and it was kind of a sham. On April 9th, 1927, Judge Thayer Webster will sentence Sacco and Vanzetti to death. In late June, there was one last attempt to get the death penalty at least removed from Sacco and Vanzetti's sentence, and the community is actually going to reach out to the governor of Massachusetts to basically oversee this. The governor of Massachusetts essentially assembles a committee to oversee this case and basically see if the death penalty is correctly suited and that Judge Webster Thayer has any biases, basically to see if there's any flaws that are going on. This committee will interview at least over 100 witnesses of this case. They'll comb through all the evidence, but sadly at the end of the day, this committee deems that Sacco and Vanzetti did have a fair trial. Sacco and Vanzetti's lawyers will try one more final attempt and actually send this case up to the US Supreme Court, but unfortunately the US Supreme Court doesn't even really look at it. They essentially refused to hear the case because it really wasn't in their jurisdiction. At least that's what they claimed. Sadly, the battle to save Sacco and Vanzetti's life unfortunately ended in August of 1927 when both men were executed by electric chair. Historians today still argue whether or not Sacco and Vanzetti were innocent or guilty, and unfortunately for us, we may never know. Personally, I really feel like the court system was trying to make an example out of somebody during this time period. It's the 1920s. Communism, socialism, and anarchy are becoming a major fear here in the United States, and Sacco and Vanzetti kind of fit that mold of somebody to point the blame to and to kind of get out this aggression that the United States really had during this time period. I think it was also an attempt to show how evil immigrants are and how they're trying to corrupt American society and how they're trying to just corrupt society in general, which makes me think of a very similar event that also happens in Massachusetts where maybe women were accused of breaking against societal norms or being accused of, I don't know, witchcraft. Unfortunately for this case, it kind of leaves people with a lot of distrust in the court system and the amount of honesty or the amount of trust that we can have within our court system, especially when the entire world is getting involved and basically saying that this entire trial was a sham, especially when the Pope himself was getting involved in basically American politics, saying hey, I think something's wrong. But this leaves me with my final question. Do you think Sacco and Vanzetti are innocent or guilty?